March 1892, in a small Rhode Island cemetery, a group of men carrying shovels gathers beside 3 graves. They Haven and Hack 39 come to bury anyone. They and Hack 39 VE come to dig someone up. With them is the town doctor, and a reporter from the Providence Journal, who are Knack 39s, going to write down every detail of what happens that afternoon. They open the first grave. Then the second. Then they reach the third. The grave of a 19-year-old girl who in hashtag 39 has been buried barely 2 months. When they lift the coffin lid, the men step back. The body hasn't and hashtag 39 decomposed the way they expected, and when they move it, they find blood still liquid inside her heart. To those men, in that moment, it could only mean one thing. The girl was a vampire, and she was feeding, at night, on the life of her own brother. They cut out her heart, burn it on a nearby rock, mix the ashes with water and give it to the sick brother to drink, hoping to save his life. It didn't hashtag 39 T work. Almost 100 years later, a few miles away, workers digging in a Connecticut gravel pit found another skeleton, one that someone long ago had dug up, partially dismembered, and rearranged in a very specific way. What modern forensic science found in those bones finally explains why so many New England families came to believe their own dead were coming back for them. And it wasn't and hashtag 39 T any vampire. Exeter, Rhode Island, in the late 19th century, was not a thriving place. People called it, with a certain resignation, and Quat deserted Exeter. And Quat. The Civil War had taken many of its young men. Those who survived mostly left for the west or for the new railroad lines, searching for something better than that rocky soil. By 1892, the town and hashtag 39's entire population had fallen to just over 900 people. Among those who stayed was the family of George Brown, a farmer, and his wife, Mary Eliza. In December 1883, Mary Eliza died of what was then called quat consumption. Today we know it as tuberculosis. 7 months later, her eldest daughter, Mary Olive, 20 years old, died of the same disease. Tuberculosis was called quat consumption because that and hashtag 39 what it seemed to do, slowly consume a person from within, fever, persistent cough, progressive weight loss, and almost always an entire family crowded into the same small house, sharing the same air through long winters. No one at the time truly understood how it spread. A few years later, George Anderslag 39's son, a young man named Edwin who worked as a store clerk, began showing the same symptoms that had killed his mother and sister. And then, in January 1892, the family and hashtag 39's youngest daughter, Mercy Lena Brown, 19 years old, also died. She had been healthy for years after her mother and sister and hashtag 39's deaths. But tuberculosis sometimes moves slowly for a long time, and then suddenly accelerates. Doctors of the time called it the anquat, galloping and quat, form of the disease. With 3 deaths in the same family, and a 4th member falling ill, Exeter and hashtag 39's, neighbours began to talk. At the time, in rural areas of New England, a belief circulated that had arrived, generations earlier, with immigrants from Central and Eastern Europe that under certain conditions, the dead could continue feeding on the life of their still living relatives from inside their own grave. They didn't in hashtag 39 exactly call it a unquote vampire and quat at the time, but the idea was in essence the same. And some neighbours began pressuring George Brown to do something about it. George Brown, according to every account from the time, did not believe in that superstition, but his son was dying, and eventually he gave in to his neighbours and hashtag 39 pressure. On March 17, 1892, a group of men, along with the local doctor, Dr. Harold Metcalf, and a reporter from the Providence Journal gathered at the Baptist Church Cemetery in Exeter to exhume the 3 women of the family, Mary Eliza, Mary Olive, and Mercy. The first 2, Mary Eliza and Mary Olive, had been buried since 1883 and 1884. Their bodies showed the level of decomposition any doctor would expect after that many years. That, by the logic of the time, ruled them out as suspected and vampires. But then they reached Mercy and #39's grave. Mercy had been dead only 2 months, and because of the winter cold, her body had been kept for a time in an above-ground stone crypt before being buried once the ground finally thawed. When Dr. Metcalf examined her, he found something that, to those present, had no natural explanation. The body had barely decomposed, and inside the heart and liver there was still blood, an amount the doctor, in his report, called what would be expected for a body buried that length of time but which to the neighbours present was definitive proof. Following custom, they removed Mercy and #39's heart and liver, burned them on a rock near the cemetery, mixed the ashes with water, creating a kind of tonic. They gave it to Edwin to drink, hoping to stop the suspected vampire #39's influence over him. Edwin died 2 months later. What did survive was the story. The Providence Journal reporter wrote a detailed account of the entire exhumation. The news travelled, it reached newspapers in England, and according to several historians, it may have even reached the hands of an Irish writer named Bram Stoker, who 5 years later would publish a novel called Dracula. Among Stoker and #39's personal papers found after his death were press clippings about the Mercy Brown case. Today she and #39's known in local folklore as New England and #39's last vampire. But she was far from the only case. In 1990, almost 100 years after Mercy Brown and #39's death, children playing in an abandoned gravel pit in Griswold, Connecticut, found some skulls. They called the police. The police called in state forensic archaeologists. What they found wasn't an #39 to a recent crime scene. It was an old, forgotten family cemetery with nearly 30 burials. Connecticut and #39 state archaeologist Nicholas Bellantoni led the excavation, and among the remains he found one that didn't an #39. He looked like any of the others. A coffin marked with 2 iron tacks, forming the initials and JB and . The skeleton inside was between 50 and 55 years old at death, but someone, after his death, had reopened that coffin. The skull had been detached from the body and placed on the chest. The 2 femurs had been crossed on top of it, forming, without anyone having planned it as a symbol, the exact image of a skull and crossbones. Some ribs showed fractures and signs of having been handled after death. Bellantoni called a Rhode Island folklorist named Michael Bell, who had spent years researching this type of case in the region. Together, they recognised the pattern immediately. It was, almost certainly, another case of ritual exhumation against a suspected vampire, and when they analysed the bones in more detail, they found something confirming the real cause: bone lesions consistent with chronic lung disease. Almost certainly, tuberculosis, searching old archives from the area, Bellantoni and Bell found a piece that connected everything. An article from the Norwich Courier, dated May 20th, 1854, reported that in Jewett City, part of Griswold, a family named Ray had suffered several deaths from consumption, and that, after the last one, neighbours had dug up and burned the bodies of 2 of the deceased sons. The JB skeleton was probably not from the Ray family, but the practice described in that 1854 article was exactly the same one that could be read, 136 years later, written directly into his bones. And here is the detail that makes this story even more tragic. In 1882, German microbiologist Robert Koch finally identified the bacterium responsible for tuberculosis. In other words, science already had the right answer 10 years before the Brown family started getting sick, a year before Mary Eliza Brown died. But scientific knowledge in the late 19th century didn't #39. Travel at the speed news travels today. Cochin Stack 39's discovery took more than a decade to reach rural, isolated communities in Rhode Island and Connecticut in any practical way. There were no antibiotics, streptomycin, the first effective treatment, wouldn't #39 arrive until 1942, and there wasn't an #39 to even a simple way to explain to a farming family why the disease passed from one person to another inside the same house. Folklorist Michael Bell, who has documented nearly 100 cases of this kind in the region, has explained that the belief likely arrived in New England with immigrants from Central and Eastern Europe, perhaps as early as the late 18th century. For a family watching their loved ones die one after another, with no satisfactory medical explanation, the idea that the first to die was unquat. Feeding unquat. On the others wasn't an #39 senseless superstitious madness. Within their understanding of the world, it was the most reasonable explanation available. Bell has documented at least 80 exhumations of this kind in the region alone, between the late 18th and late 19th centuries. Most in Rhode Island, which came to earn, half-jokingly, the nickname unquote, the Transylvania of America. Unquote, the last known case, curiously, didn't #39 happen in New England at all, but in the mountains of Pennsylvania in 1949, long after the real cause of tuberculosis was already common medical knowledge. Today, Mercy Brown and #39 grave still draws visitors. Some leave flowers, some leave coins, some still believe, half seriously and half jokingly, that her headstone holds some kind of power. The real explanation is much simpler and much sadder than any legend. Mercy wasn't an #39 vampire. She was a 19-year-old who died of a disease that, at that very moment, science in Europe already knew how to explain, except that information hadn't, a #39, reached her town yet. Her body hadn't, a #39, decomposed the way they expected because it had spent the whole winter stored in a stone crypt, above frozen ground, before it could be buried. It wasn't an #39 magic. It was cold. And the skeleton found in the Griswold gravel pit, the man we know only by the initials JB, stamped on 2 coffin tacks, never received a full name. We and #39LL never know who he really was, beyond what his own bones were able to tell forensic science a century after his death. The one thing we know for certain is how he died, and why someone, desperate to understand a tragedy they couldn't #39 otherwise explain, decided to dig him up and rearrange his skeleton into the shape of a warning. For nearly 100 years, dozens of families across New England dug up their own dead, searching for an answer to something that already had a name and a known cause, written up in a laboratory thousands of miles away. It wasn't #39 cruelty. It was desperation, trying to fill the gap left by science that had a #39 arrived yet. Tuberculosis, not vampires, was what truly emptied those farmhouses. And the bones, once someone finally knew how to listen, ended up telling that truth far better than any legend ever could. Every bloodline tells the truth, even when, for 100 years, we preferred to believe another story.